We are often told that the British Empire was built on steam engines and free trade and the rule of law. But in the 19th century, the greatest empire on earth was actually running the largest criminal enterprise in human history. To balance their bank accounts, the British government became a drug cartel. They grew opium in India and smuggled it into China at gunpoint. And when the Chinese government tried to say no, Britain went to war to force them to keep buying the drugs. It was a war fought not for freedom, but for the right to sell poison. To understand how the respectable gentlemen of London became international drug dealers, we have to look at a cup of tea. By the 18th century, Britain had become addicted to tea. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It kept the factory workers awake and the aristocracy civilized. Every year, British ships sailed to Canton in China to buy millions of pounds of tea leaves, porcelain, and silk. But there was a massive economic problem. The Chinese emperor had no interest in British goods. The British tried to sell them wool, but China was too hot for heavy wool. They tried to sell them clocks and scientific instruments, but the Chinese considered them mere toys. The Qianlong emperor famously wrote to King George III, saying, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures." This created a trade imbalance. Since the Chinese wouldn't take British goods, they demanded payment in silver. For decades, silver flowed out of Britain and into China. The British treasury was bleeding dry. The East India Company, which held the monopoly on trade, was facing bankruptcy. They needed to find something, anything that the Chinese would buy. They found it in the poppy fields of Bengal. The British had conquered Bengal and India in the mid-18th century. They discovered that the climate was perfect for growing opium poppies. The East India Company established a monopoly on the production of opium. They forced Indian farmers to stop growing food and start growing drugs. They created a factory system for processing the sticky poppy sap into balls of addictive opium. This was not a small operation. It was an industrial-scale production line run by state bureaucrats. They standardized the quality. They stamped the balls with the company logo. They packed them into chests that weighed exactly 133 pounds. But there was a legal hurdle. Opium was illegal in China. The Chinese emperors had banned it because they knew it destroyed society. So the East India Company came up with a clever legal loophole. They didn't sell the opium directly to China. That would be illegal. Instead, they held auctions in Calcutta. They sold the opium to private traders, mostly British and American merchants. These private traders then sailed the opium to the coast of China and smuggled it in using small, fast boats. The East India Company could wash its hands of the crime. They could say, "We are just selling a product in India. What happens after that is not our business." But everyone knew the truth. The entire economy of the British Empire in Asia relied on the drug trade. By the 1830s, the plan was working perfectly. The flow of silver reversed. Instead of silver leaving Britain, it was now pouring out of China to pay for the drugs. The human cost in China was catastrophic. Opium is a terrible drug. It causes lethargy and severe addiction. It destroys the will to work. In the early days, opium was a luxury for the rich. But as the British flooded the market, the price dropped. It spread to the soldiers. It spread to the government officials. It spread to the peasants. By 1838, it is estimated that there were up to 12 million opium addicts in China. The drug was eating the country from the inside out. The army was useless because the soldiers were high. The administration was corrupt because officials were taking bribes to let the smugglers pass. The Daoguang emperor in Beijing saw his empire collapsing. He realized he had to act. He appointed a man named Lin Zexu as his special commissioner. Lin Zexu is one of the true heroes of Chinese history. He was incorruptible. He was intelligent, and he was determined to save his country. In 1839, Lin Zexu arrived in Canton. He surrounded the foreign factories where the British merchants lived. He demanded that they hand over their opium stocks. The British merchants refused. They thought he was bluffing. But Lin Zexu was not bluffing. He locked down the district. He cut off their food and water supplies. He made it clear that no one would leave until the drugs were surrendered. After 6 weeks, the British superintendent, Charles Elliot, finally surrendered. He ordered the merchants to hand over more than 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu took the opium to the beach at Human. He didn't just burn it, because burning it would release fumes that might get the workers high. Instead, he dug massive trenches. He mixed the opium with lime and salt water to chemically destroy it, and then washed the sludge out to sea. It was the 19th century equivalent of the biggest drug bust in history. Lin Zexu also wrote a famous letter to Queen Victoria. It is a masterpiece of moral reasoning. He wrote to her, asking how she could allow her subjects to sell a poison in China that was illegal in Britain. He wrote, "I have heard that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country, because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries." The letter was never delivered. The British Foreign Office refused to accept it. Instead of apologizing, the British government was furious. When the news reached London that the Chinese had destroyed British property, they didn't see it as a sovereign nation enforcing its laws. They saw it as an insult to the British flag and a violation of free trade. Powerful lobbyists representing the drug merchants pressured the government. They argued that if China was allowed to seize British goods, then no British merchant was safe. They wrapped their greed in the language of liberty. They claimed they were fighting for the principle of free exchange. Parliament debated the issue. There were some voices of conscience. The young William Gladstone spoke against the war. He called it unjust and calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace. He said that the British flag, which used to be a symbol of justice, was now being flown to protect an infamous contraband traffic. But the money spoke louder than the morals. The vote passed. Britain sent the Royal Navy to punish China. The First Opium War was a massacre. The Chinese military was still fighting with matchlock muskets and bows and arrows. They had wooden sailing junks. The British had the Nemesis. The Nemesis was the first iron-hulled steam warship to serve in the Far East. It was a monster of the new industrial age. It could sail against the wind. It was impervious to Chinese fire. It carried heavy cannons that could obliterate a fortress from miles away. The British fleet sailed up the coast of China, systematically destroying every coastal defense they found. They didn't just target the military, they bombarded cities. The Chinese soldiers fought with desperate courage. There are accounts of Manchu bannermen fighting until the last man killing their own families to prevent them from being captured by the foreign devils. But courage cannot defeat steam and high explosives. The British captured the strategic city of Zhenjiang, which controlled the entrance to the Yangtze River. This effectively cut off the food supply to Beijing. The emperor had no choice but to surrender. In 1842, the two sides signed the Treaty of Nanking. The Chinese call this the first of the unequal treaties, and it was truly unequal. The terms were humiliating. China had to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. 6 million of those dollars were specifically to compensate the drug dealers for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. Think about that. The Chinese government was forced to pay the criminals for the drugs they had confiscated. China also had to open 5 ports to British trade where British subjects would be exempt from Chinese law. And most famously, China had to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever. But the most incredible part of the treaty is what was missing. The treaty didn't say a single word about opium. The British negotiators knew that if they put the legalization of opium in writing, it would look terrible to the rest of the world, so they left it out. But the unspoken understanding was clear. The smuggling would continue, and China was not allowed to stop it. And continue it did. In the years after the war, the opium trade exploded. The number of addicts doubled, then tripled. The British Empire was now officially the narco state of Asia. But one war wasn't enough. By the 1850s, the British wanted more. They wanted access to the interior of China. They wanted to legalize the opium trade officially. They wanted embassies in Beijing. In 1856, they found a pretext to start the Second Opium War. This time, the French joined in, eager for their own slice of the Chinese melon. This war was even more brutal than the first. The Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing. When they arrived outside the capital, they found the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan. The summer palace was a wonder of the world. It was a vast complex of gardens, temples, and palaces filled with the art and treasure of 5,000 years of Chinese history. It was the personal residence of the emperor. The British High Commissioner Lord Elgin ordered the destruction of the palace. It wasn't a tactical decision. It was an act of vengeance and cultural erasure. 3,500 British troops spent 3 days looting and burning the complex. They smashed porcelain that was priceless. They tore down silk tapestries. They filled their pockets with jade and gold. And then they set fire to the buildings. The smoke from the burning palace was so thick it blotted out the sun over Beijing. The famous French writer Victor Hugo later wrote a scathing essay about this. He wrote about the 2 bandits who entered a museum and looted and burned it. He said one of the bandits was named France and the other was named England. The destruction of the Summer Palace broke the spirit of the Qing dynasty. They signed the Convention of Beijing in 1860. This time there was no ambiguity. The opium trade was legalized. Christian missionaries were allowed to travel anywhere in China. And more territory was given to the British in Hong Kong. The consequences of these wars were profound and lasted for a century. For Britain, it was the peak of their power. They had forced the largest nation on earth to bend the knee. The profits from the opium trade funded the British Indian government and helped build the Victorian cities we admire today. But for China, it was the beginning of the century of humiliation. The Opium Wars destroyed the legitimacy of the imperial government. The people looked at their leaders and saw weakness. They saw that the emperor could not protect them from the foreign drugs or the foreign guns. This led to a series of internal rebellions, most notably the Taiping Rebellion, which was one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. It led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. It led to the warlord era. And ultimately, it created the conditions for the rise of the Communist Party. When we look at modern China today and its attitude towards the West, we cannot understand it without understanding opium. In the West, we learn about the Opium Wars as a footnote in trade history. We might hear a joke about tea, but in China, every schoolchild learns about the burning of the opium by Lin Zexu. They learn about the burning of the Summer Palace. They visit the ruins, which are kept as a national monument to shame. To the Chinese, these events are the primary evidence that the West preaches about human rights, but practices exploitation. They see the modern Western complaints about trade rules or intellectual property as hypocrisy. They remember when the West kicked down their door to sell drugs. The British Empire eventually stopped the opium trade in the early 20th century, not because they suddenly developed a conscience, but because domestic pressure in Britain finally became too great. The moral rot of the empire had become too obvious to ignore. But the damage was done. There is a concept in history called blowback. The idea that actions taken today will have unintended consequences decades or centuries later. The Opium Wars created a deep well of resentment. They taught China a brutal lesson. The lesson was that in the international arena, might makes right. They learned that if you want to be respected, you must be strong. You must have the ships and the guns to sink the drug dealers. When we see China building a massive navy today, when we see them asserting control over the South China Sea, we are watching the long echo of the Opium Wars. They are determined that there will never be another Treaty of Nanking. The story of the Opium Cartel is also a mirror for the British Empire itself. We like to think of the Victorian Era as a time of high morality. We think of strict social codes and church on Sunday, but the foundation of that society was rotting. You cannot build a moral civilization on the profits of addiction. The tea that the British drank in their parlors was paid for by the misery of a Chinese peasant in an opium den. The silver that built the banks of London was washed in the salt water of the Canton Harbor. It exposes the dark side of unbridled capitalism. The East India Company was a corporation. Its legal duty was to make a profit for its shareholders. If the most profitable thing to do was to sell poison, then the corporation would sell poison. And if the government tried to stop them, the corporation would buy the government or start a war. It is a warning about what happens when commercial interests are allowed to dictate foreign policy. When we prioritize the balance of trade over the balance of humanity, we end up in a world where gunboats are used to open markets for vice. The Opium Wars remain the ultimate stain on the British flag. It is the moment when the mask of the civilizing mission slipped and the world saw the empire for what it truly was in that moment. A drug pusher with a navy. This story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about where wealth comes from. When we look at the grand historic buildings of Europe, or the old money of the great families, we rarely ask about the source. We admire the architecture, but sometimes, if you scratch the surface of the gold leaf, you find the black tar of opium underneath. The legacy of the Opium Wars is not over. We are living in the world that it created, a world of deep mistrust between East and West, a world where historical grievances drive modern geopolitics. And it all started because a nation of tea drinkers didn't want to pay in silver. They wanted to have their tea and sell their drugs too. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. We judge empires by their monuments, but perhaps we should judge them by their merchandise. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing an empire exports is not its ideology, but its greed.